Good morning and welcome to the latest in our ABNY Talk series. Thank you everyone for joining, and I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. I'm Sarah Samuels, the Communications and Programs Manager at ABNY. Please feel free to reach out to me or the ABNY team with any questions. You could reach us through email or through social media at ABetterNY. So thank you all for joining us for this next installment of our ABNY Talk series in partnership with CBC. New York City Property Tax with Ana Champeny. Ana is the Director of City Studies at Citizens Budget Commission, or CBC, where she focuses on property tax, housing, economic development, environmental policy, and municipal finance. Previously, she served as the Director of Property Tax Analysis in the Division of Tax Policy at the New York City Department of Finance and the Supervising Analyst for Housing, Economic, and Infrastructure at the New York City Independent Budget Office. Ana also served as Director of Budgetary Affairs for the Westchester County Board of Legislators. She holds a BA from Bellevue College and an MPA from Baruch College. Following Ana's presentation, we will start with some pre-submitted questions and then move on to live questions. Feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation using the chat function, and we will monitor it. With that, I will pass it along to Ana. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you, Sarah, for that introduction, and good morning. So thank you for joining us. The Citizens Budget Commission, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a nonprofit think tank dedicated to constructive change in city and state government. And as Sarah said, I have been studying the property tax for well over a decade. And look forward to sharing my insights with you this morning. So let us get going. All right. Okay. So the property tax is fiscally important for most local governments, and New York City is included in that. It is often the largest revenue stream. And in New York City, its structural features dampen rapid changes in assessments, which makes it stable both through economic ups and downs. But some of those features are also the reason why the tax is much maligned in New York City. It is very complex and opaque. Few New Yorkers understand the tax well, which contributes to mistrust and a sense among most that they are paying too much and that someone else is paying too little. And this mistrust is in some cases warranted. Analysts have documented many inequities within the tax. The tax burden, measured as the effective tax rate or taxes as a share of market value, can differ for similarly valued properties of the same type. For example, two one-family homes in New York City, both worth $800,000, can have very different tax bills, depending in part on which neighborhood they are in and how quickly their values have been appreciating. Similarly, a single-family home with a higher value, such as a multi-million-dollar brownstone, can have a lower tax burden than a home with a lower value, such as a $600,000 home in Staten Island. But beyond that, tax burdens are also higher for commercial and rental buildings than they are for owner-occupied residential properties. These are all issues that we will be looking at more closely during the webinar. So as I said, the property tax is the largest and most stable revenue source for the city. It is expected to generate $31 billion in fiscal year 2021, which will begin July 1 of 2020. And that is more than half of all tax revenue and more than 1/3 of the total city revenue. So in other words, 1 out of every $3 that the city spends comes from the property tax. And as the chart shows, growth since 2000 has been fairly steady, and for the last decade, it has averaged 6.2% a year. This is the result of both two tax increases, one back in 2003 and another one in 2009, as well as market value appreciation over this time period. Before we get into the specifics of the New York City tax, I want to talk about property tax administration more generally. The first step is for a local government to determine the market value of the land and improvement which it is taxing. This is set by assessors and utilizes mass appraisal techniques like computer modeling. The second step is then to determine the taxable assessed value, the portion of the market value that will be subject to the tax. In New York City, there is an assessment ratio, limitations on changes in assessed value growth, and exemption programs that reduce assessed value for qualifying properties. After that, the nominal tax rate is applied to the assessed value, which generates your tax bill. In the next few slides, we're going to look at New York City's complicated system in more detail. The city has what we call a classified property tax system, and properties are assigned to class based on size and usage. So class 1 has 1, 2, and 3 family homes and some small condominium buildings, residential condos. Class 2 is actually subdivided into some further classes. You have classes 2A, B, and C, which have 4 to 10 unit residential buildings. This includes rentals, cooperatives, and residential condominiums, while the rest of class 2 has residential buildings with 11 or more units. Class 3 has utility property, while all other commercial property is in class 4. The Department of Finance is required to use consistent valuation methods within a class, but the methods do differ between the classes. For class 1, they use what is called comparable sales. These are computer modeled values that are looking at actual transactions taking place in the city. Class 2 and 4 are using different income methods. Smaller rental buildings, smaller residential buildings have a gross income multiplier, which means that the gross income is just multiplied by a certain number. It could be 5, 6, it depends on the type of property and its location. Net income capitalization is used for larger residential buildings and commercial property, and this is where the total income minus expenses, the net income is capitalized, and it's an expectation of it's an implied rate of return that an investor would expect for that building based on its income stream. So there are then target assessment ratios. There are targets, which means that the market value cannot exceed this percentage, but it can be lower. So in class 1, the target is 6%, and for all other classes, it is 45%. And lastly, New York City has 2 different types of limitations on assessed value change. The first are caps, in where assessed value growth due to market appreciation cannot increase more than 6% in 1 year or 20% over 5 years for class 1, or 8% per year, or 30% over 5 years for the 4 to 10 unit residential buildings. For the rest of class 2 and for commercial property, changes are phased in over 5 years in equal pieces. So once the value is set for each property by finance, the final tax roll is released. This happens in mid-May, so we're expecting that shortly. If we look back at fiscal year 2020, we can see these are the market value shares. So at that point, there was $1.3 trillion of market value in New York City based on the Department of Finance valuation. Nearly half of that was in class 1, and almost a quarter each in class 2 and 4. The utility property is a very small portion of this. It's a small class. And similarly, the taxable, once you go through the process of determining the taxable assessed value, you could see how the shares of assessed value differ from the share of market value due to the assessment ratio and limits. So class 1 is 8% of taxable assessed value, class 2 is 37%, and nearly half of the taxable assessed value is in class 4, the commercial property. So once the class, so in setting the tax, the New York City Council is first required to set class shares. And this is the share of the levy that each class pays. And it is based very much on a formula and regulations set by the state with annual adjustments for physical and market changes. The intent of the class shares was to keep the portion of the levy that each class is paying pretty consistent over time. And the class levy shares are now on the table. You could see class 1 is 15%, and class 2 and 4 are each about 40% of the levy. And the total levy was $32.6 billion. So the class, so the first step is you determine the overall levy, which is this overall rate, 12.283%, multiplied times the taxable assessed value in the city of $257 billion. And that gets you that roughly $32 billion levy. And that levy is then distributed among the classes based on the levy shares. So class 1, for example, is required to pay 15% of the $32 billion. It works out to about $4.7 billion. And then in the last step, the council determines the nominal tax rates. And the nominal tax rate is simply the levy divided by the total assessed value that the class has, essentially how much you must tax each of the assessed, how much you must tax the assessed value in order to generate the class levy. So this is so what are the main problems? First is a lack of transparency and simplicity, which is probably very obvious after having gone through those two slides, which just barely scratch the surface of how the system works. The second is that this valuation of property is not always reflective of the market or what property is selling for in arm's length transactions between two independent parties. The third is that the assessment growth caps and phase-in lead to what we call intra-class inequities, so differences in tax burden between property in the same class. This is that similarly valued properties can have different effective tax rates, and also that higher valued property can have a lower effective tax rate than a property that is lower valued. The fourth is that class shares fix the distribution of the levy and lead to higher effective tax rates in certain classes. And lastly, the fifth is that many exemption and abatement programs offered by the city can be poorly targeted. I'm going to focus on these three middle ones and illustrate them in a little bit more detail before talking about the Property Tax Commission and some recommendations that they made recently. So the first is that the different methods used to set market values can generate Department of Finance values that are significantly different from the price for which properties are being bought and sold. And this contributes to mistrust of the system because the value assigned by DOF is not always similar to what an owner might expect to sell their property for. And it can also make it hard to compare values and tax burdens across different types of properties. So if you look, these are actual, sorry, that should be 400. There's a typo in there. The 4 should be a dollar sign. So it's $530,000, not 4.5. The one family home sold for $530,000. The DOF market value was $482,000, so 91% of the sale price. You can see the condo unit had a DOF market value of just $155,000 while it sold for over $1.2 million. So the DOF value was just 13% of the market, of the sales price. And this is because the Department of Finance is required to value co-ops and condos using the potential net income that they would generate if they were rentals. And this tends to, as shown, this does lead to a significant undervaluation of condos relative to sales. The larger rental buildings and office buildings are also similarly undervalued by Department of Finance relative to sales prices, but not to the extent of the co-ops and condos. So the next issue to consider is that the growth caps and phase-in leads to inequities within the class. For the growth caps, if market value is growing more quickly than the cap, the assessment ratio is reduced. And in class 1, where there is a target ratio of 6%, the median is actually about 4.4%. And there are properties in the city that are assessed at less than 1% of their market value. And lower assessment ratios lead to lower effective tax rate for tax burdens. And there is very much a geographic pattern as evidenced by the map that I'm showing. The light blue in Brooklyn, those are the neighborhoods in the city with the lowest median effective tax rate. And then as you get into the blues, the effective tax rate is increasing. The orange areas are higher, and the highest median effective tax rates are in the areas shown in red. So northeastern Bronx, Staten Island, and parts of Queens. And so what does this mean? It means that a median $1 million home, if one exists, would pay $2,600 in property tax in Park Slope, while a $1 million home in Bay Ridge, the median would pay $7,400, or it could pay as high as $10,700 in a neighborhood like Woodlawn, where the effective tax rate is higher. Another way to think about this is, what would the value of a median home paying a certain tax be? So the median home paying $7,400 in property taxes per year would be worth nearly $3 million in Park Slope, but less than $700,000 in Woodlawn. The next problem that I wanted to look at more closely is the distribution of the levy according to class shares, which leads to inequities between the classes. So effective tax rates, as we've been saying, taxes relative to market value differ between the classes. And commercial, shown in green, and large rental buildings, shown in orange, face a higher tax burden than predominantly owner-occupied residential housing, shown in blue. And the way class shares are set and reset annually limits the ability of the city to redistribute tax burdens among classes. So these are very much fixed due to the class shares. And so there were two legal challenges to the property tax system in the last decade. The first was that argued that these inequities, which I've been talking about, were discriminatory. The first lawsuit was dismissed in 2015. An organization or group called Tax Equity Now New York, or TENY, filed another lawsuit in 2017, and that was dismissed earlier this year. However, the plaintiffs are appealing. And it was in the context of the TENY legal challenge that the mayor and council appointed a property tax commission that was charged with recommending changes to improve the fairness, simplicity, and transparency, while also ensuring no reduction in property tax revenue. The commission released its preliminary report on January 31st, 2020, and included 10 recommendations, but the focus was really on addressing valuation and intra-class inequity among residential property. And it's important to note that most of the changes being recommended would require state legislation. There's very little that the city can do on its own. So one set of recommendations envisioned a new residential class that would include all 1 to 3 family homes currently in class 1, all co-ops, all residential condos, and all 4 to 10 unit rentals. So a large part of class 2 would be moved into a class with class 1, creating this new residential class. All of the properties in this class would be valued on comparable sales. So this would be eliminating the valuation of co-ops and condos based on rental income. They would be assessed based on 100% of market value. So we would be eliminating fractional assessment for this class. And lastly, it would eliminate the assessment growth caps. There would be a phase-in of changes over 5 years. So I want to talk briefly about the sales-based valuation of co-ops and condos. The current method relies on imputed rental income and is a very distortionary aspect to the system. It undervalues co-ops and condos relative to sales prices, as we saw. This is a table that the commission published in their report looking at, sorry, I think this is, this would be condos. And so the median condo is 20, the DOF value is 20% of the sales-based value. But you can see that as the value increases, that ratio decreases, which means that the Department of Finance captures less and less of the sales-based value as the price of the unit increases. Switching to sales-based valuation for an entire residential class like this would substantially increase the market value in the city. And for these units, it does not necessarily mean that the taxes would grow up at the same rate. The tax rate for the class would be reset to account for the higher assessed value and market value. And what would this new class achieve? It would definitely increase the transparency and simplicity. It would allow condo owners to compare their tax bills and their valuations to co-ops, to other 1-2 family homes. They would actually see values that are somewhat reflective of what the sales price would be. It would make the DOF market values, as I was saying, more reflective of the market. It would reduce intra-class disparities because it would be eliminating the caps on assessed value growth, which is what had really driven the higher tax burdens in certain neighborhoods in New York, like in northeastern Bronx and in Staten Island. The increase in market value from sales-based valuation would actually increase the city's operating limit, which is the amount of property tax that it can levy, as well as the debt limit, which is the amount of long-term debt the city can have. Both of these are set by the state and pegged to the total market value in the city. There is also a chance that this would increase the number of tax appeals by these properties, because if you're assessing someone at 100% of market value, any reduction in market value that could be achieved through a tax appeal would reduce the taxes. So it would make appealing potentially more beneficial to these properties than it is under the current. The commission also recommended a homestead exemption and a circuit breaker. These are programs that are intended to reduce taxes for primary residents and are income tested and targeted. So a homestead exemption exempts a portion of the value for owner-occupied primary residents below a set income level. A circuit breaker is a little bit more complicated. It provides means-tested property relief for lower income households. And it specifically looks at property taxes as a share of income and tries to ensure that they are manageable relative to income. These programs may improve targeting of property tax relief and make the property tax a little bit more progressive for this class of properties. But the commission was vague on some of the details, like what the income limits would be or what share of income would be used for the circuit breaker, and that has made it difficult to do a full assessment of the implications of the proposal. There were some other recommendations. There was a recommendation for a different method for setting tax rates, but as with the homestead exemption, it lacked details that makes it really hard to assess the impact over multiple years. However, it would maintain the existing average tax burden between the classes and therefore limit the ability to address some of those inequities in tax burdens between rental and commercial property and residential property. It maintains or recommends maintaining assessment methods for classes 2, 3, and 4, and suggests that there should be a 10-year reassessment of the property tax. So what are the prospects and momentum for reform? Unfortunately, they have diminished in recent months. First, the ruling on the Tenney lawsuit. So there is an appeal filing that was definitely perceived as reducing some of the momentum to move forward with this. And then more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic has really taken the wind out of the sails for any reform of this type of policy change. And another piece to consider is that as Mayor de Blasio's second term enters its final 18 months, the time needed to implement reform is starting to run out, and property tax reform is generally not considered to be first mayoral term policy, so it's unlikely to be something that is addressed in the next administration. So that concludes my remarks, and I'm happy to answer some of the questions that you've pre-submitted and some new ones that you have been submitting.
So that was one I truly knew very little about this topic personally, so it was really informational and educational to hear more about it. First question, how are taxes and how are they approved?
So the process of setting the tax is really, it's a budgetary process that takes place during negotiation of the budget. So the mayor has the authority to set all non-property tax revenues, and he submits a letter to the council that outlines what the city is expecting to generate from other taxes and other non-tax revenue sources like fees and fines or state aid. And then essentially what happens is that the total budget is set and they figure out how much difference between the total spending and the non-property tax revenues, and property tax is supposed to fill that gap. In reality, the city has this convention where they have that overall tax rate of 12.283% that hasn't been increased since 2008. And generally what is done is that the city takes a look at what the assessed value is. They multiply the assessed value by that overall rate. And then that sort of generates the number of, or the amount of the levy. Tax increases, when the city talks about tax increases or tax decreases, they're really referring to that overall rate. So as I mentioned briefly, there were two tax increases to the tax rate increases that were implemented. One was in 2003 and another one was in 2008, and they were both sort of following recessions when other tax revenues plummeted and the city needed additional resources once the budget. So the city, unlike many other taxes, the city has the authority to set its own property tax rate without legislative approval from Albany. It is one reason why the property tax is often sort of the first place the city goes when it needs additional revenue. And all the council needs to do is basically set a higher rate or set a levy that is higher. And then the rest of the calculation in terms of determining how much each class will pay and what each class's rate will be is very much formula driven. There's not very much discretion there. There is some, but not that much. But on the other hand, it's important to note that people's tax bills are going up pretty much every single year as the market values and assessed values have been going up. And so those sorts of tax increases are not what the mayor and the council often say they have not increased property tax rates, and that is regarding that overall rate, but the tax bill and the tax levy do go up every single year.
Great. And then this next question is about the current pandemic that's going on. So how can we ensure that property owners don't become distressed from property taxes as the commercial rental revenue goes south and building valuations stay the same?
So there are definitely concerns about the impact of the pandemic on the property tax system. While the tax roll that will be released this month for fiscal year 2021 is pretty much set, and was in fact set before the pandemic. A tentative roll was released back in January before all of the health issues that the pandemic started. So there are definitely concerns in fiscal 21 about whether or not there will be any change in the delinquency rate or non-payment or other concerns or other issues of that sort. There is also then the expectation that sort of looking prospectively, because for commercial and rental buildings, the valuation is very much a function of income. If the rents that building owners are able to charge decrease or go down, the valuations of the buildings will go down. So there is some chance, I think, the department, not the department, I'm sorry, the Office of Management and Budget released their forecast, and they assumed slightly slower growth in property tax during the forecast period, so during the next few years. So I think there's definitely at least an expectation that the rate of assessed value growth will slow or potentially even sort of flatten. But there's definitely a lag in the property tax system, and that's what has usually helped during a recession. So taxes like the personal income tax, or in this particular case, the sales tax, you will expect to see them plummet pretty quickly because they're reacting to what is happening in the economy right now. And the property tax lags and is a little bit more slower. And so that usually helps the city get through a recession. But I think in this particular case, given the extent to which the economy has been shut down, there are concerns that we're going to have some delinquency on the property tax, and that could also be a cash flow issue for the city.
Understood. And this next question is, are excessively high taxes on multifamily properties discouraging construction of new apartment buildings in New York?
Excuse me. There's definitely an interaction between property taxation and development decisions being made. And real estate industry does consider sort of the property tax when it decides what types of development it can undertake. So there's both, because rental properties have a higher effective tax rates than even commercial properties. There is a sense that it is, if a site can accommodate both, it is more beneficial to build an office building than it is to build a rental building. Another concern in terms of within residential housing is that the effective tax rate on co-ops and condos is lower than it is on rental buildings. And so this can make it more profitable to build a condominium development, especially a luxury condominium development in certain parts of the neighborhood, than it is to build rental housing. And while there are different tax abatement programs, the most well-known one being 421A, or now called Affordable New York, that are supposed to provide tax incentives to develop rental housing, and more recently to really focus on affordable housing. There has definitely been a slowdown in housing production, and New York City is not building enough housing relative both to the need in terms of the population and relative to what other cities are building. Every single year housing also, it's not just a net increase. There's both an inflow and an outflow. Older buildings may be demolished. They may no longer be used for residents. So you need to at least, there's a certain amount of construction needed to maintain the housing stock. And then there is construction needed to increase the stock to make sure that you have enough housing to meet population demands. And this constraint on the development of housing, which we think is in fact related to the property tax and the high property taxes on rental housing, is likely contributing to the affordability crisis in the city. So if there was more construction, there would be, hopefully, that would be beneficial both in terms of affordability.
Great. If you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about the New York City property tax system, what would it be?
This is a hard one. I go between two of my favorite pieces. One is the valuation of co-ops and condos. So this is referred to by folks who study the property tax is Section 581, that is the part of state real property tax law that has this requirement that you value co-ops and condos based on rental income. And it is possible that this made some sense back in the 1980s when the requirement was put in place. That was a time when there was a lot of co-op to or rental to co-op conversions. Many of these were non-evictions, non-eviction conversion plans, so that many of the co-op buildings still had significant rental, sort of significant portion of their units occupied by renters. And there really were very few, if any, condos at that time. Condo development is sort of a more recent phenomenon in New York City real estate. And so maybe it made sense back then, but as the market has changed, it has really become more and more distortionary. I'm sorry. And so I think this is definitely a big area that needs to be reformed. The values of these units are completely divorced from what they're selling for. And so you see, you see an individual building, a co-op building, have a market value that is lower than the sale price of individual units in that building. And then you're looking at taxes, but you're looking at taxes relative to this very undervalued market value, or this very low market value. And this sense of what is the real tax burden in co-ops and condos is hard for owners to understand. And on top of that, there's a co-op and condo abatement. I didn't talk about it, but an additional program specifically to reduce taxes on co-ops and condos to try to bring them in line with 1 to 3 family homes. In some cases, it actually provides more tax relief than would be needed if you were just trying to equalize the tax burdens. And so this really distorts taxation of co-ops and condos and how the liabilities are distributed across the different units and across the sort of spectrum of values. And I think a lot of the frustration in the city about taxation of luxury condominium and condo units would be addressed if you were actually valuing them based on their actual value rather than on this fictitious rental value. And the Department of Finance does what it can to determine a rental-based market value for co-ops and condos. It's not an easy task. And if you're thinking about looking for comparable rentals, like maybe you can find a comparable rental for a co-op unit in sort of Queens or some of the neighborhoods in Queens and Brooklyn. It's really hard to do on the, on these luxury co-ops and condos that are being developed and built now. And so, some of this does not, finance is doing what they can, but there's definitely a limit to how much you can implement this methodology. And so I think that would be a big change. I think coming in second place would be eliminating the assessment growth caps in class 1 and class 2, because I think as that map that I showed makes pretty starkly clear, is that these assessment limits are really resulting in a redistribution of property tax burdens from rapidly appreciating neighborhoods to those that have more modest market value growth. And so these, to me, are two very distortionary pieces in the property tax system. And we were really pleased, CBC recommended that both of these be changed to the Property Tax Commission, and both of those were in their recommendations. So we were really happy to see that.
Great. Oh, I think I maybe, sorry, I just cut out for a second there. So will COVID-19 affect how assessments are done? And if so, how?
I think that's a really good question. And I think there's another one of these pre-submitted questions that I saw that sort of asked about the lag and timing, and the fact that, the Department of Finance, owners there is a lag. So when they release a tax roll, it's supposed to be reflective of the property value as of that prior January. And so the tax roll coming out this May is supposed to show what your value is before the pandemic, and it's not going to affect or reflect COVID-19. And so folks are going to have to pay taxes based on their pre-pandemic values. And then the question is, what is the Department of Finance going to do in their next round of evaluation? And this is almost a sort of an ongoing cycle. They're going to start early this summer thinking about the next tax roll. It's a pretty, there are over, I don't know if I said this, there are over 1 million parcels in New York City. And unlike many municipalities, New York City does an annual reassessment. So every single year, they're determining a new value for each parcel. And so that's a pretty substantial undertaking, and the department spends many months on it. So I think the questions are, you're going to have, on class 1, where they're looking at comparable sales, we're already seeing a slowdown in activity. There are fewer residential sales. And the question is, are they going to have enough transactions in which to develop their models? And how are they going to weight the more recent transactions versus the sort of pre-pandemic transactions? But if people are paying less to purchase class 1 properties now and in the next few months than they had been before, we should expect to see that on the next tax roll. On class 2 and 4, where it's income driven, I think there's a little bit more of a lag. So property owners, by and large, are expected to file what are called real property income and expense statements that provide sort of their prior year's income from their different tenants and the expenses on maintaining the building. But because these are the prior year, most of the filings due in June will reflect income and expenses before the pandemic. The Department of Finance does adjust and make sort of tweaks those values to reflect sort of the time lag. The question is how they will perceive and understand the impact of the pandemic on income and what kind of adjustment they may make. But I think there is an expectation that on these income producing properties, that due to non-payment by tenants, due to lower rents, due to potentially higher vacancies, et cetera, that you're going to see net income decrease, and that should decrease the values. So I think, excuse me, that at least on the tentative roll that will come out next January, which would be the first time we would expect to see sort of post-COVID-19 valuations from the department, that you would see either probably much slower growth in market value than we have been seeing in the recent years.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now we're going to move on to the submitted questions through the Q&A function. So I would encourage everyone to keep submitting those. These are great and we love to see them. So this first question is from James Nani. So he asks, it sounds like the Tenney suit is dead, and in combination with the COVID-19 pandemic and the end of the mayor's term coming up, do you think the chances of the state making changes to the system are slim?
Thank you for that question, James. I wouldn't necessarily say that the suit is dead just yet. There is one more appeal, so I think we have to let the legal system play out and see what happens. But I do really think that the initial decision that we got and the pandemic have really sort of taken, as I said, the wind of the sails on this one. And so with there being 18 months, there being a new mayor coming in, I think that the chances for reform are kind of, I think we missed the boat on this one. I think there was really a potential to have done to have really pursued this more aggressively during the beginning of the second. You know, most folks, most observers assume that, you know, property tax really is a second term issue because of term limits in the city. I think it's also something that is much easier to do during an economic upswing. So when the economy is doing well and when you're sort of more economically sensitive taxes like personal income and sales taxes and business taxes are performing well and growing, is the time that I think you really can look at a tax like the property tax, because in addition, it gives you some more opportunity to maybe consider a tax reduction as a way to offset, you know. The assumption always is on property taxes that if you're doing reform, you're really going to shift the liability. Even if you keep the total pot of money the same, as the mayor had asked the commission to do this time, it makes it a zero-sum game, but it's still going to shift property tax liability between owners, and to some extent very substantially. And so some folks will pay a lot more, some folks will pay less. And if you can do this during a time that the economy is doing well and maybe your other taxes are performing well, maybe you can do some tax relief to offset some of those increases that folks would see. So I really think that the pandemic, the recession, the legal ruling, the political calendar, all of these things are very much aligned against any property tax reform in the next couple years. And for those of us who've been observing and working on this for years, that's really disappointing. I think we thought there was a window here and some momentum, and it's disappointing to see.
This next question is somewhat related. So Constantine asks, what impact, if any, will COVID have on the city's property tax revenues? Considering many property owners, especially smaller mid-scale owners, are struggling financially, is the city considering offering any assistance to those who will struggle in making property tax payments?
Thank you, Constantine. That's a good question. So I think that there's the property tax, you know, for right now, the city is not assuming a substantial decrease in property tax collections. But I think there are definitely downside risks here in terms of both non-payment and value reductions. So I think that the city has a number of payment programs that they offer, but these are primarily targeted to homeowners who may be having difficulty paying their property tax. So there's a deferral program, there's a specific deferral program geared towards senior citizens who are lower income. The city does offer payment plans, so you can sort of do a down payment and then pay over time. So there are some opportunities. As far as I know, they have not rolled out a specific property tax relief program for business yet. So I don't know what, if anything, they may do in that regard. But, you know, if you look at how the city has weathered the last two recessions, a lot of it has been by being able to lean on the property tax and then raise the property tax rate. And in this particular situation, neither one seems as sure. You know, there is a potential that the rate of growth will slow in property tax revenues and that the delinquency rate will increase. This is something we're planning to take a look at a little bit more closely. And then the other piece is, you know, this is really not the time to think about a property tax rate increase, given that you're already concerned about whether or not people can meet the existing liabilities. So I think that the city is definitely in a harder position than it had been in the last two recessions.
Great. And then this next question is, My understanding is that the property taxes are based off of numbers from 1.5 years ago. It is also my understanding that changes in assessments are phased in over 5 years. Does this mean that we won't really see property taxes fully go down until maybe 7 years later? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, there really is this very long lag in the property tax. This phase in is what we call the pipeline. And it basically means that you've sort of got some, it works both ways. So first, if you're looking retrospectively, we have a lot of these increases from the last few years when the market was still doing well that have yet to be reflected on the roll. And those are going to come on in the next few years. And so, that's going to offset some of the decrease that we're expecting to see. But additionally, that decrease itself is going to be phased in. So I think, you will start to see it before 7 years, but it won't be, for class 2 and 4, at least it won't be a downturn. Like it won't be the values dropping. The values will grow more slowly than they have been growing. And it's important to note, property tax values, or the valuation from the Department of Finance has been growing at a very robust rate. That 6.2% increase in the property tax levy over the last decade. So in the last decade, there hasn't been a rate increase. And so all of that growth in the property tax levy has been a function of two things. One is growth in the values, and the other is new development. And I don't know the exact percentage, but new development is a smaller part of it. So much of the growth in the property tax levy that has enabled the city to develop new programs and increase its spending has been because the real estate market has been growing really well. It's also generated a lot of frustration in neighborhoods where property taxes are growing much faster than income, and is making the city more and more unaffordable for property owners. And so these are definitely a lot of concerns that have to be weighed and balanced. And one of the reasons that folks were looking to property tax reform to address some of these inequities and redistribute burdens. And there was something, sorry, I think there was one other piece. We can keep going, and if it comes back to me, I will talk about it.
Great. So this next question is, sorry, I'm just reading it off. How else could the city make up its current budget shortfall without increasing property tax rate, which accounts for more than half of its operating budget, particularly given if you expect the effective rate to fall within changes in assessment from COVID-19? And that's from Alexander.
Well, thank you for that question. This is the challenge facing the city's budget office, and many of those of us who are monitoring and looking at the budget. So as I said, the property tax is half of the tax revenue, a third of the total budget. I think the expectation is that it's going to grow more slowly, but that it won't decline. So I think the answer in the short term is, the city is doing two things, or actually three things, to balance its budget. One is it's getting some federal aid, and it's asking for more federal assistance, and so that's covering some of the shortfall, though not as much as many observers in the city would like. Another piece is that the city has cut spending. So the mayor has a citywide savings program that has reduced spending by about $1 billion this year and a little bit more for fiscal year 21. Many of those savings, or a substantial portion, have to do with them canceling programming related due to COVID-19. So for example, They're not expecting to run a summer youth employment program this summer, in large part because of the pandemic, but they've gotten some savings by canceling that. In CBC's sense, the savings are not as robust enough, and they're not recurring. So most of the savings are happening in this year and next year, and less so in sort of fiscal year 22 and out. And the third piece is that they've gone to some of their reserves. So the city does have some reserves that it has in the budget, and they've tapped those to the extent possible. So that's about $1.3 billion between the 2 years, between this year and next, or 1.4. And there's also a fund called the Retiree Health Benefits Trust, where the city has been putting voluntarily depositing funds for retiree health benefits, which are expensive, and the city has a substantial long-term liability for those. That fund had about $4.7 billion in it, and so the city is planning to use $2.6 billion, so more than half of that, to cover the immediate shortfall. So the city has a plan for fiscal 20 and 21. There is a fair amount of downside risk. You know, if property tax collections are below what they expect, if other taxes perform less well than expected, you know, the city will need more resources. But the other problem is that, you know, recessions tend to, I don't know, they do last, even with the big, you know, with a V-shaped recovery and pretty quick coming out of a recession, you're still going to have tax revenues lagging your forecast for a while. And so right now, the city is expecting gaps of $5 billion or more in fiscal year 22 and out, and they don't have a plan yet for how to fix or how to fill those. And so we're very concerned about the need for a long-term strategy. You know, the federal government and reserves aren't going to be there to fix it. And so I think the city is really going to need to step in and do some more cutting of spending cuts and trying to improve efficiency and make programs as effective as possible so that they're using taxpayer resources to deliver the needed services.
Great. Well, on that optimistic note, I think that we will conclude because we're almost out of time. But I would encourage everyone to send me any outstanding questions at s.org. And Ana, especially, amazing app. I think everyone is really interested in this topic and craving content at this time. And I really appreciate you joining us today. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you all for listening and for all of the excellent questions that you asked. I also urge you, you know, that we have a lot of information both about the current budget and state budget and the fiscal situation on our website. It was on the front at cbcny.org. So I urge you to check it out and read some of our reports and ask, you know, you can reach out to us with additional questions as